We teach music because in the history of man has always made music. It has been a form of communication that does not need a translator. I can go to any place in the world and play Charles Ives, and they can respond to it. They don't need a translator. Music is a communicative means by which I can express something to someone, no matter what keeps us apart, language or any other way, because of the way that we're wired as human beings. This is the great communication vehicle. If the whole world sang, we would have a terrific world, because we would get to know each other, to know that we share things. You can do it best in music. And when people can't express things in words, they use music.
Welcome to Director's Circle, a podcast featuring insight from music educators and school leaders discussing their philosophies on the administrative leadership of a comprehensive music program. I'm Doug Conrad, and today's guest is Mr. Frank Battisti from Leverett, Massachusetts. Let's begin. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Director's Circle. I'm Doug Conrad. Thank you so much for tuning in. The podcast has now been active for a little over a year, and I just wanted to thank all of you for all of your support throughout this process. For every like, for every share of an episode, for every download and listen, I'm forever grateful, and I would like to thank you for all of your support throughout this endeavor. If you are liking our episodes, please make sure to stay up to date on all future news and episodes by heading on over to Facebook and giving us a like under our show page under Director's Circle, as well as following our accounts on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Another way you can stay updated on all future episodes is subscribing to the show on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play Music, and iHeartRadio. Today's guest is a very special interview because throughout history, people have been able to have unique conversations with leaders in the field. There were once people that had conversations with Babe Ruth about baseball. There were other people that spoke to Mark Twain about writing a great story. Well, today I am happy to feature our interview with Mr. Frank Battisti, featuring his insights on the importance of music as well as his philosophies on music education. So now, on to our next episode with a man who needs no introduction, Mr. Frank Battisti. Hello, Mr. Battisti. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's nice to be with you.
Yes, it's been great. Looking forward to this interview. So to start things off, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your professional background?
Yes, I was born in Ithaca, New York. My mother and dad were both immigrants. They both came from Italy. I'm first generation. I went to Ithaca High School. I graduated in 1949. I went to Ithaca College, earned my bachelor's degree in 53, and then went right back to the high school I graduated to just teach lessons. I was not the band director. I was just a teacher of instruments, and I did that for 2 years. I consider that one of the great opportunities that I had, because it was nice as a beginning teacher not to have the responsibilities of running an organization, but of becoming the best teacher I could be. I could study all the instruments. I could prepare myself to teach. That was very, very important 2 years of my life. I began to teach at Ithaca High School in 1953. I taught there until 1967. I was the director of the high school band. I was also the chairperson of the instrumental music department. From there, I went to Baldwin Wallace College for a year and a half, and then Gunther Schuller invited me to come to the conservatory in Boston to start the wind ensemble, which I did. By the way, 2019 marks the 50th anniversary of my founding of the New England Conservatory Wind Ensemble. So that gives you some idea of my educational road.
Certainly, and that's a very storied career, and with a lot of that too, you were well known for your work not only at the England Conservatory, but also with your work as a public school educator at Ithaca High School. So to talk about that a little bit from your experience teaching in public schools, a lot of what we talk about on the podcast is centric to music education, but to take a step back and to kind of have a more broader perspective, let's talk about the overall curricular objectives of what any child should go through in their K-12 music experience. So with that said, what do you think should be the educational objectives of any academic institution?
What educational institutions should do is to help an individual know themselves better, develop the skills needed to function in modern-day society, but most of all, to help them develop an appreciation, an understanding, a knowledge of the world they live in, both natural world and man-made world. Developing that appreciation is huge, and without it, it can become very focused on the kind of necessary working things that a person has to do. One should not lose track of the great things that surround one in the world we live in, and the ability to appreciate that. I think the ability to appreciate is very, very important in education. That means you have to have some knowledge. You have to have some excitement about something. You have to be a person who is curious. All these things are the things that should be nurtured in a public school education.
Definitely, and as part of that appreciation, we can bring into the realm of music and appreciating a lot of things, not just with the art form of music, but it can tie into things such as cultural aesthetics, historical aesthetics, and many things. So even not just centered towards the performance-oriented realm of band, orchestra, or choir, but where does music education play a part into the conclusive education of all students in the academic setting?
Well, we should look at why music is important. Music is important because it allows people to express, create, learn, and feel in ways that can lead to a deeper and better understanding of oneself and others, both cognitively and emotionally. Very, very important. It provides opportunities for individuals to feel, very important, think, and solve problems creatively to arrive at answers and conclusions in imaginative and unique ways. There is not a right way. There are many ways. 2 and 2 does not always equal 4. 2 and 2 could equal 3 plus 1. And we are allowed to create things that don't have to arrive at very specific answers. We don't have to create them in specific ways. We're giving opportunities to do and to feel. Very important. Feeling is very important. Because of the universality of music, it allows people to transcend time, geographical, national, and cultural boundaries. When people make music together, the differences between them disappear, and the common denominators between them are magnified. They develop and know what unity means, what sharing means. This is huge in the world we live in today.
For sure, and with a lot of that too with music dealing with a lot of aesthetic experience and a lot of bringing around an understanding of awareness. One kind of thing that we have seen, especially in the last 20 to 30 years, is where, not with any central school, but education in general, it's become very centric around a culture of really trying to quantify everything, whether that means trying to have the highest test scores, trying to focus a lot on weighted GPA courses, or even trying to have the highest score at a state assessment for performance ensembles, or even some teachers trying to have the highest teaching evaluation score that you can have. So with that said, now with music, there's sometimes things that we can assess and put a score to, but even with it being an art form though, where something it's not as measurable by number, but there is still substance there, how would you justify the importance of music education to somebody who says it might not be as important as other subjects in the educational curriculum, curriculum, such as those that have a lot more measured things, such as a standardized test or the like?
It's important that we develop the ability for people to retain the important things relative to the human experience. Young people presently are engulfed in a world of popular entertainment, computers, electronic devices, and they can gradually lose touch with feelings and deprive themselves of the emotional reserves that are indispensable in life. This is what music can do. This is what they don't get in the other courses. The important thing is that the content of what we do in music, what we use, the music we use, has to be of high quality. Content determines whether a subject is important or not. I mean, literature is important because of the quality of the literature. Science is important because of the quality of the science. Music is important when that quality matches the other subjects that we think of as being important. And sometimes, often, the quality of music being played in school ensembles is nowhere near at the level of these other core subjects. I don't think it's a matter of marks. I think it's a matter of the quality of the content.
And with that said then, speaking of quality, and a lot of times to the specific realm of a performance ensemble such as a band or choir, how would you define quality in musical repertoire or quality in the aesthetic experiences we give our students through quality music?
The student has very little say about what they play, so that the quality of the music is determined by the teacher or the conductor of the group. If I consume excellent literature because the teacher has excellent musical values, the potential for me to develop high values is greater than if I'm eating junk food. Just like if I eat potato chips, it's not the same as eating vegetables. The person who determines that is the teacher. The teacher, when we pick out music to use with our students, we're doing more than picking out pieces to play on a program. We're defining the curriculum so that the quality of the literature, in almost all cases, is determined by the standard of the teacher. And so if that student is constantly consuming high-quality nutritional music, they develop values in proportion to that. And if they're not, they don't.
So on the topic of developing those values, we also develop a love of music within our students to be lifelong consumers of music. So if we were to get on that track now, how would you suggest that we get kids to fall in love with music in our classroom, whether it be in band or in a high school music appreciation class?
Well, how do we fall in love with anything? We fall in love because we're attracted to it. And we're attracted to it by a human being. So that the quality of the teacher is huge. That the quality of the teacher is such that the student is attracted to him or her. The possibilities exist for that teacher to influence. So it's the kind of magic formula that happens in all human contact. And so I can try to make music that I think the student has some appreciation from. In other words, I'm going to start where the student is, but I'm only going to start there because I've got to take them somewheres. So that the music that I choose some of it will be familiar and some of it will not be familiar. Because the unfamiliar stuff is going to take that child to places they never have dreamt about being. But they're going to discover their world is going to get bigger. They're going to not lose what they love, but they're going to expand and love more music. That is our challenge. And depending upon our ability to stimulate, to encourage, to entice the student to come with us, to explore, to ignite their curiosity, That's what great teachers do. I mean, great teachers have no problem. And if you don't, maybe you don't belong in the classroom.
Those are a lot of good points. So to talk about the specifics, how of maybe we can go about getting students to fall in love with music, let's take a hypothetical situation where, let's say if I had a time machine and I were to go back a few decades and I were to visit your band room at Ithaca High School. If I were to hang out in your band room and observe rehearsals for, say, about a week, what kind of things would I observe in your rehearsals that were utilized to help your students have a lifelong love for consuming quality music?
Well, let me take you through this. When the student came to rehearsal, they would know exactly what they were to do. In other words, they would know how to warm up. They would know when they were to be in their seats. They would know what music was going to be rehearsed, what measures in these pieces were going to be rehearsed. They would enter a room in which all the composers who they were going to play during the year, their signatures had been traced, enlarged on the wall. That was done every year. So they're surrounded by the signatures of all the composers that they're going to play. The students, in the course of the rehearsal, will understand that the real challenge is listening. We have to listen. The most important thing we do is listen, and on the wall behind my conductor's stand at the high school were in 6-foot letters the word listen, because it isn't a matter of tuning, it's a matter of listening, so that the student has to know at all times who they should be listening to. Now, that means that one has to stop and one has to ask questions. Who should you be listening to? If I'm playing scales or chords, I want everyone to sing the root. In other words, you might not be playing the root, but you've got to hear the root in order to tune whatever chord it is. The student would also know that they were expected to show up with their parts learned. This is not a drill shed. This is a place where it's a collaborative music experience. We bring to each other the gift of our preparedness. So every student is prepared so that the rehearsal is a collaborative one. It's exciting. It's joyful. We're not drilling parts. Students know what we're going to rehearse in advance. They were expected to prepare. Also, there would be 6 scores available. And so, for example, if a percussion player were not playing, they were looking at a score. And there were times when I would just tell a student, I don't want you to play today, I want you to look at the score. We would always talk about what we were trying to express, that the issue was not technique, but the issue was, what are we trying to express with the technique that we will be using? And that every sound, they knew that every sound they produced had to be motivated by a desire to express something. You never played a note to make sound. Sound is not music. Music is the art of sound. So that's a kind of general characterization of what would be going on in a rehearsal.
Those are certainly a lot of neat rehearsal tactics, and I especially like the tactic you talked about of bringing the signatures of the composers onto the walls in such a way that that's bringing the composers into the room. And when I hear that, that even brings to mind some of the immaculate signatures you've ever seen of composers. For example, like if anyone's ever seen an old YouTube video of a young person's concert with Leonard Bernstein, they would have his signature, which might as well be a piece of art, in my opinion, just with how immaculate and detail-oriented his signature would be. But speaking with that, would that be something that you use an old overhead projector with and that kind of process?
You could, but the beauty of it was that the kids, during the summer, just the process of painting the hall and of putting it on, they were doing it. It was theirs.
Certainly, and out of all the signatures of all the composers that you've done through the years, was there any signature just that might have stuck out more than one over the other just for its work or even how it looked?
Well, I think that the signature that they liked the best was Warren Benson's, simply because Warren spent so many hours at the high school with the band, so that they had a great affection for him. So they would be attracted to him, but they were attracted to Stravinsky. They were attracted to, I commissioned over 20 pieces when I was at the high school by very, very important composers, Pulitzer Prize-winning composers, and I wrote to Leonard Bernstein, and I wrote to Shostakovich, and I wrote to Sam Barber. I wrote to all these people asking them to write a piece for my high school band. Stravinsky, when I wrote to him, couldn't believe that young high school students would like his music. And he wrote back and told me that if he lived long enough, he'd write a piece for me. Well, he didn't live long enough. He only had about 18 or 20 pieces before mine. But my students weren't dealing with educational writers. They were dealing with the same composers that were being played by the most important artists in the art of music. In other words, they were up to speed. This is where music is.
Certainly, and to tie that in getting back to the subject with having a lifelong love for consuming music, and where we've talked about now how do we get students to be lifelong consumers of music, it's also important that we nurture a love for music within our audience base. So with that said, are there any ways that we can utilize the band repertoire to build and enrich our audiences so that they are active consumers of music throughout their lives?
Well, we have to step back a little bit. First of all, out there in the adult world that we live in, there are literally millions of people who played in school ensembles. I mean, some of them 6, 7, 8, 10 years. They were getting what is known as music education. Now, they're out there now, and we have a society in which music is a very low priority item. So that one could say, well, what kind of music education did they get? If I had gone to a math class for 10 years and I couldn't add or subtract or multiply, you would say, hey, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. Well, we could say the same thing about past music education. It has not produced people, or has not created or helped create individuals who love music. They love the activity of music, they love the band, but they don't love music. They fall in love with the vehicle. And that's because I think so many band directors think themselves as, teachers of the band. They really should be thinking themselves as the teacher of the art of music. We are supposed to be helping these kids develop and understand and appreciate music so that it can be part of their lives forever. So, all our musical institutions and art institutions in this country have to beg in order to stay alive. It's because we have failed in music education to create people who love the art of music. They love the activity of music that we have in the public schools. And that has to be changed if we're going to have a society, an American society, that listens and appreciates music.
So now to touch on that and to kind of take a step back when we were talking about repertoire being of quality too, when choosing repertoire for most secondary or even middle school groups, which are generally in the ballpark of a grade 2.5, some up to the way of a grade 5 depending on the performance setting of the school, but what types of things should a director of any idiom choir, band, orchestra consider when taking into account what kind of things should I look for that will make my kids not just fall in love with playing this piece or for, even as you said, the vehicle of the band experience, but what will this piece of music give my students to really have that strong love, appreciation, and lifelong consumership of music?
That has to be developed. And it's developed in the rehearsing and in the choice of music and in the way it is the experience that the teacher creates for the student in exploring the music. One has to nudge students towards an appreciation of music because the discovery process is the Eureka moment. In other words, I can't tell 2 and 2 make 4 to a kid. I can't tell him that. I have to give him these blocks and then let him discover that, yeah, there's 4 of them. And so in the musical experiences that we create when we're rehearsing music, and remember that if I'm going to rehearsal and I'm drilling notes, that is not a musical rehearsal. That's not a musical experience. That is a drill experience. It's a technical experience. The musical experience is when you get beyond the playing of notes. So if I am picking out music that is way beyond what my students' natural ability is, and I have to drill to get there, and that we finally can play it, but we have no idea what the composer's intent was in creating those symbols and hoping that we get back to the expressive intent that he or she wanted. So that if in my rehearsing of these pieces, I have to always have the kid think, every sound you're making has to be for an expressive reason. And through a consistent exposition of students to literature that says something, that has questions, that challenges the kid's intellect and emotion, I can hook the kid in this experience of music. But it's a process, and it happens over time.
To take this now into maybe a specific instance, let's say if we were to go observe you conducting an honors festival, such as, say, an all-county band or something of the like. If we were to have you in your first rehearsal with those students, it might be a 2 or 3 day event of a few rehearsals and then a concert at the end of those 3 days. In your first meetings with those students, where you're maybe introducing yourself as a human being and as a conductor, but then also just introducing the pieces of repertoire that are on their stands, they're looking at data, they're looking at notes, they're looking at rhythms. And maybe after you get the initial read through of a piece, what would you maybe say to students to really get them to bring the music to life, to maybe get them to listen louder than they play, so to say? So what kind of ways do you get kids to really dive into the music and really try to bring out the most expressive elements of that repertoire?
Well, I just conducted a regional band a few months ago. First of all, when we sit down to play this piece, I don't want this to be the introduction to the music of the students. So a month or 2 before the actual date of the event, I wrote a personal letter to every single kid, told them a lot about the music, told them where they could hear performances of this music on YouTube, and urged them to prepare their parts so that when we met, we could immediately begin to think about the expressiveness that's in this music. I'm not interested in reading. I'm not interested in reading. You have to read, but my rehearsals are not for reading purposes. My rehearsals are for making music, so that the more time I spend in other things than the collaborative, expressive musical experience, the more I detract from what it is. I mean, if I go to an orchestra concert and I hear Strauss or Mahler, I come out and I'm overwhelmed with what I hear. But if I go to a band concert, I come out and I start talking about the trumpets and the trombones and the clarinets. That's a sure sign that you haven't hit the bullseye, because the idea of great music is the homogeneousness of its elements, not the elements themselves. So that we have to focus on when you come to rehearsal, you have to be prepared. We want to start on the downbeat, making music. That means being prepared. So that I would expect the student to be prepared. And believe it or not, when I got in front of this group, we started, that's exactly what I had to spend very little time on anything technical. It's preparation, preparation, preparation.
So now to touch on the art of teaching even a little further, I know you are a big fan of reading and a big fan of literature, and with that also comes a lot of famous quotes. And one quote that comes to mind in About What We Do is by St. Thomas Aquinas, where he had a famous quote where he once said, "Better to illuminate than to merely shine, to deliver others contemplated truths than merely to contemplate." How can this quote apply to us in our role as music educators?
Oh, that's great. I'm glad you asked me that because, my clinic at the Midwest in December, the title of it is Better to Illuminate Than to Shine. As teachers, we're the lamplighters. We're the illuminators. If we're musicians, if we are interested in the expressiveness of music, then in our rehearsals, we're going to turn the lights on so that the students can see what's in the notes, not play the notes, but see what's in them. Because the symbolism that they see on their part is there to help them try to find out what the composer intended relative to expressiveness. Our notation system is very limited, so that we as musicians have to have great imagination. We have to imagine this is one way that the composer could have thought. Now, if the composer is alive, I can ask him, but if he's dead, I can't. But I must have the imagination to see what the possibilities are and then decide which one of those possibilities I'm going to try to illuminate, because the child can't see it. The child sees the symbolism. I have to try to illuminate them so that the child sees them, hears them, feels them, creates them, realizes them. And that's the lamplighter. That's what we do. We illuminate. We should remember that the important things in the musical experience are the music makers, the people who, well, first of all, the person who wrote it, the creator, then the recreator, the people who are making the music. I'm the lamplighter. I bring the light. I am not the light. I bring the light. So there's a recognition of my role. I'm not the head honcho. I am the illuminator. I am the lamplighter.
So to speak on illumination and the specific application, or what we could say maybe the how, let's say if we were to go in a rehearsal and as the role of an active conductor being a leader of an ensemble, speaking of how we must illuminate a lot of the creative elements of music for our students, where do you feel that the majority of the illumination might come from? So specifically meaning, would a lot of that come from our conducting abilities to be able to communicate that in the active time when we make music with students, or would a lot of that even come from our teaching when we're verbally giving instructions, or even you could say from when we're talking with students, from how we illuminate our passion and wonderment and creativity in music?
As a person working with, let's say, high school age students, I approach it more like a coach, a teacher, coach, conductor. I've certainly got to help the student grow and learn and develop the knowledge that allows them to realize the expressive intent of the music. The conductor, these gestures work beautifully when you have great players in front of you, because they have had the experience of working in a situation where gestures become the language, so that we can communicate without speaking. With young people, we can't do that. They need instruction. Once they arrive at a point where they have enough skill and enough experience to be able to respond just to gesture, then the gesture becomes important and should be used. But it's a process of getting there. A child does not have natural inclination to respond to gestures that a conductor gives. They are conditioned and trained to do that. So that with high school kids, I would stop, I would explain, I would ask them questions, I would make sure that they were growing in their knowledge and understanding. So in a way, I coach. I'm a coach. I'm more of a coach, like a chamber music coach would be, than I am a conductor. Now, when the performance comes and we've arrived at that point, then I can be a conductor.
Those are some great points, Mr. Battisti, and I really liked hearing your insight on being a coach in collaboration with being a conductor and how they work together. So now, to take a different spin on a different avenue of our profession, something that is prominent, especially more at the secondary level, are a lot of times you'll see active performing ensembles go through different adjudications, whether it be for a numerical score or a role such as superior or a good rating, or even say a contest, whether it be solo and ensemble, or even a marching band contest. So what are your thoughts on the role these adjudication and contests play in the comprehensive approach to music education?
Doug, let me read to you the mission statement of the Ithaca High School Band. At Ithaca High School, all Ithaca High School band experiences were directed towards helping every student find joy and excitement in music making and creative endeavor. Students studied and performed great music in small and large ensembles, composed pieces for their instruments, and collaborated with composers in giving birth to new works written especially for them. Development of a creative way of life, as experienced through creative musical endeavors, was the desired goal of the IHS band program. Our objective was to illuminate the benefits and values to be derived from performing and consuming, listening to great music. Becoming the best band in the land was never our objective. Being the best we could be individually and collectively was. The policy of the Ithaca Public Schools prohibited school ensembles from participating in contests or competitions. Music was considered an art, and teachers were challenged to educate in a manner that helps students develop excitement for the intrinsic value of music, to become music lovers. Contests and competitions were the antithesis of this educational objective. There were no trophy cases in the music department at Ithaca High School. The prizes we sought and found were harbored in the hearts and minds of both the students and faculty. Music is an art. It's not a competitive thing. We shouldn't make it that. I mean, again, if I'm overwhelmed by the hearing a performance of Strauss, and I'm just overwhelmed with the music, I don't leave orchestra performances talking about the trumpets or the trombones. In a competition or in a festival, that's what you listen for. You listen for rhythm, you listen for pitch. You should listen. Are you saying anything? Are you wounding me? Are you communicating to me? Are you making me feel something?
Those are some unique thoughts, Mr. Battisti. So with that said, there are still many times throughout the school year where many music programs will go to a lot of different assessments, adjudications, or contests. And do you still feel that even with all these different functions going on, are there any benefits at all to sending music groups out to these types of events?
You know, I used to bring in a number of guest conductors to work with the band. For the money I would spend on buses and everything else to take my band to a festival to play for 15 or 20 minutes and to get something written up on a sheet of paper, I could get a lot more for my money. And also, if I am involved in those festivals, then it seems to me that the adjudication and the clinics that follow these adjudications have to be something in which you're working with both the conductor and the players. It's a collaborative thing, so that the players will be what they do will be the result of what the conductor stimulates them to do. So if I'm going to work with a group, I'm going to work with the group. That means the conductor and the players. If I work with half of them, that's of no value. You're trying to put something together. It's a collaborative music experience. So if I'm going to have someone come in, or if I'm going to ask for help, then I have to ask for help in the totality of the music making. So, if you're going to festival and there are opportunities for the, whatever you call them, adjudicators or the listeners, they should be able to work not just with the players, but to work with the conductor and the players to note what can be done to improve the collaboration. It isn't a matter of making the players better. It's a matter of making the collaboration better. You see, I think that if you're going to have a festival, the important thing is for everyone, when they're not playing, to listen to everyone else. Becoming a listener is very, very important. Children usually drop their instrument when they graduate, but all of them continue to listen to music. And we spend very little time on helping them develop the ability to enjoy listening to music. That's why we don't have them out there. We have people listening to, the popular music. It doesn't take any commitment, doesn't take any effort. It's effortless music. Music of artistic merit demands something. And we should help students grow and understand that with some kind of knowledge and some kind of experience, that this can be a very enjoyable and fulfilling experience, consuming music. We need to develop the consumer of music so that the individual, when they leave high school, hopefully will become this monstrous public who consumes music, and music not of just what comes over the FM radio, but music of artistic merit, because they have learned how to, as Copeland says, what to listen for in music, so that they can understand it and enjoy it and find fulfillment in it.
Those are a lot of good points, Mr. Battisti, and I really enjoyed hearing about how you talked about the collaborative approach to the music making, where we're not just kind of considering what these students are putting on, but also the collaborative act of what they're doing with the conductor teacher. So with that said, a lot of roles sometimes assessments can play throughout the country, even now go into where we talked before about quantification of teacher assessment, and they can also play a role in some parts of the country where instead of a classroom observation and a administrator is using, say, the Charlotte Danielson model to assess a teacher's effectiveness, they might just take a contest score and say, if your band receives a superior score, you are a superior educator. So now to take a step back and to look at that type of thing, what advice would you maybe have for somebody who is not as familiar with music, or somebody if they're assessing the effectiveness of an educator, not relying so much on the score, but how do we look and assess how that educator falls into the act of making music with students?
When the action or the behavior of the conductor and the behavior of the students either shows that they have a reverence for what they're doing, or that it's just another thing that they do. Creating music is a special privilege. It is a special experience. And so how the behavior of the students, the behavior of the conductor tells me a lot. We now have to measure everything out in the sense that it has to have some kind of grading system on whether you're excellent or good or average or below average or whatever. In music or in the arts, that's not valid. That's not valid. I mean, with me, when I listen to a musical performance, if I'm not wounded, in other words, if it does not leave a mark on me, then I don't consider it I don't consider it bad, but I want music to wound me, not badly. But when if I cut my hand and it heals, there's a wound there. I carry it around for the rest of my life. So I want experiences that implant themselves on me as a human being and stay with me. How a piece ends, how they celebrate the end of a wonderful performance, not by standing up and cheering like it was a student athletic rally, but in a way that honors and reverences the experience. Now I hear when I go, a band starts playing, everybody's whistling and cheering and everything. It sounds like I could be at a basketball game. I don't. They're cheering technical achievement. They're cheering excitement. There's not enough reverence. Maybe the music doesn't deserve it. Maybe the music is not good enough. But when I have respect for something or someone, I have a reverence for them. I act differently. That's what great art does. It kind of humbles us. We're humbled by the greatness of what this is. I don't know if any of this makes any sense or not.
Oh, no, it certainly makes a lot of sense. And to now talk a lot about that, especially through a lifelong appreciation of music, there certainly goes a lot of stories. And I can imagine in such a prolific career as yours as a conductor, author, and educator, that you have had many great experiences, not just with music in life, but with a lot of people you've encountered in music, whether it be composers, performing musicians, or even other conductor educators. So this kind of makes me think of whenever David Letterman used to be on TV and he would bring on Don Rickles and he would share a lot of stories from back in the day with Sinatra and Dean Martin and all that. It really kind of made me think of something special with this interview. So do you have any stories from your career that you would like to share?
Oh, I have lots of them, but let me pick out two. Again, when I was a high school band director, because this is what the focus of your podcast is. We used to play, the high school band used to play an assembly program for the students in the high school every year. It was always a double assembly because the population of the school was larger than the hall could hold. So we would always play two concerts. I always felt that those were the most important concerts we played because we were playing them for fellow students. My students in the band were playing them for their friends. So I would bring in an excellent soloist every single year for that concert. I had Doc Severinsen come up there and play when he was a side man with Skitch Henderson's band. I had, Harvey Phillips, Don Cinta. I had everybody. I had gone through 12 or 15 soloists, and I just couldn't think about who can I get. And I finally decided, look, I'm going to get a jazz person. So I said, well, I wonder if I can get Benny Goodman. So I called up Harry Randall at Selmer and said, do you think it's possible for me to get Benny to come here for a couple assembly programs? And he said, no, it's impossible. The Selmer company has offered him money to do clinics for us. He's not interested. But just before he hung up, he said, you commission all these people to write pieces. Why don't you write a letter to Benny and tell him about your commissioning thing? So I did, and 6 weeks went by, and one day I was teaching in my office, and the phone rang, and it said, the voice said, is Frank Battisti there? I said, yeah, this is Frank Battisti. He says, this is Benny Goodman. How about next Thursday? This is honest to God truth. So I couldn't believe it. I said, well, sure, Benny, next Thursday's fine. After I hung up, I went to my principal and told him that, if we could arrange for an assembly program next Thursday, we could have Benny Goodman. So obviously he did. The day arrived, I went up to Syracuse to pick him up. He flew into Syracuse. On our way back to Ithaca, I noticed he didn't have his clarinet. And I said, Benny, I don't see your clarinet. He says, I'm not going to play. I said, Benny, well, why aren't you going to play? He says, they don't like my music anymore, because this is when rock and roll was taking over. And I said, Benny, everyone is expecting you. The whole city is expecting you. You've got to do this. He says, I'm not going to. He says, I came here to see this band that created all these, that's commissioned all this music. And so we got to Ithaca, and I kept pleading with him, and finally I was able to get him to say, okay, I'll do it. But then he said, I got to have a clarinet, and I'll only play Selmer. So luckily we had one student in band who played Selmer. All the rest of them played, I think, buffets. And so we got it. Benny asked the kid for a reed. He slapped it on the instrument and played. So for the rehearsal, I arranged a noontime rehearsal with the jazz ensemble. Benny goes in, stands in front of it, makes a few comments, and then after about a half an hour, he says, I'll see you on the battlefield. And so the big moment comes. The students come into I had set up the jazz ensemble in the middle of the gym. The students came in. They sat on the floor, sat in the bleachers. The band played a couple of Benny's charts, 1 o'clock jump, etc. And then came the big moment when I was going to introduce Benny. And I introduced Benny. He walked out and he started playing, and the place went up in smoke. It was terrific. It was absolutely fabulous. Benny had a wonderful time. Afterwards, obviously, kids wanted his autograph, everything else. And after all it was all over with, I drove him back to Syracuse. He bought my dinner for me and got on the plane to return home. And it didn't cost us a cent. It was all on Benny's dime. So that's an unbelievable experience, true experience. The other one was when I was trying to get Shostakovich to write a piece for my band. I would write him in English through the League of Soviet Composers, had to go through them, and he would write me back in Russian, which I'd have to take up to Cornell University to have the Russian people up there translate it for me. We went back and forth, and I couldn't get him to think, I couldn't get him to understand that I wanted an original piece. He thought I wanted to do arrangements of his music, so he sent me some scores, which I still have. So I've got letters from Stravinsky, I've got letters from Shostakovich, Leonard Bernstein, that I treasure because I wrote to them and asked them to write a piece for my high school band. Now, most, it seems almost preposterous that a kid or a young man who's teaching band in the middle part of central New York, in the middle part of the state, would have the courage or be nutty enough to write to these people to ask them to write for his high school band. But I wanted my kids to have the best they could possibly have, and I wanted them to understand, the world of music they lived in. So I was motivated by desire to do something that would be exciting, that would be a great experience for my students.
Those are certainly remarkable stories, and I really enjoyed hearing about how Benny Goodman just came to your school and borrowed a student clarinet. So that kind of makes me think, like, say if we were to go see Paul McCartney in concert and he played his guitar, but then he threw his guitar pick out into the crowd, and as a lot of people sometimes are at live events, if they receive the drumstick thrown into the audience, or the guitar pick, if you will, they'll hold on to that as a cherished memoir from that musical experience. So let's say after Benny Goodman borrows your student's clarinet, and you take him back to the airport, he hops back on the plane next week when you're back in school at Ithaca High School, and your student has their clarinet back just after Benny Goodman, one of the biggest musicians at the time, if not the biggest musician in the world, even for that instrument, has touched and played their instrument. What did your student do with their clarinet, or did they have any kind of thing unique to say with that instrument for the rest of their high school experience using it?
Oh yeah, I mean the person whose clarinet it was Brian Brian Earl was the student's name. His father was Bob Earl. I don't remember if you remember, but Bob Earl was the MC on the College Bowl that was on TV, where teams from colleges competed against each other. And Bob was a backyard neighbor of mine in Ithaca. He lived in Ithaca but went to New York for the TV shows. And it was Brian, and Brian was a terrific clarinet player and a terrific jazz clarinet player, still is. It's still playing jazz in clubs around central New York State. Oh, yeah, I mean, that became a treasure, a very treasured thing. And the chair that Benny sat in still has Benny Goodman sat here on the back of it. And of course, Benny, had to borrow somebody's reeds, and he said, I was trying to get my kids to understand how important reeds were, and you have to take care of everything else. And Benny says, he says, you don't have to worry about that. He says, if you can play the instrument, it doesn't matter what reed it is. You just got to read and played it.
Yeah, it's certainly a great story to hear, and it's great to hear that they even still keep the chair and all that stuff too. I can imagine that is quite the treasure at Ithaca High School in the band room. So now, to move on to some general questions that we ask all of our guests, could you talk about one or two of your favorite rehearsal tactics?
I don't know if I have a tactic. I approach everything. I analyze what the problem is, and then I try to create a solution to it. They're often different. I don't have any stock kind of answers to questions. I try to, as I said, analyze it, figure out what the solution is, and then proceed to solve it. The one thing that I would always, the things that they would always hear from me, no matter what, was listen and what do you want to express? What do you want to express, and listen? Rhythm, pitch is listening. Rhythm is listening. Everything is listening. So that the one thing I would stress, though, is I would stress the development of sections. When in the yearbook, besides a picture of the whole band, we used to have pictures of each section, because great ensembles are the result of great sections. They're not the result of 50 great players. They're the result of a great low brass section, a great trumpet section. So the development of the section, so that I take great responsibility on the section leader to make sure that if there was something in the section that had to be done, that they would assume the responsibility of getting it done. That's why you sit in the first chair. It's your section. And it's a matter of, first of all, thinking, are we playing great as a section? Then secondly, are we fitting into the total ensemble and making the contribution we should make? So that I put a great emphasis on the playing of sections and the combination of those sections, those great sections, that achieve the ensemble, not on the individual within the ensemble.
Lots of great points there, and to now touch on a subject we've somewhat talked about before in the interview, but if someone were to ask you as a blanket statement and you had to give a little bit more of a philosophical approach of its importance to humanity, why do we teach music?
Well, we teach music because in the history of man has always made music. It has been a form of communication. A form of communication that does not need a translator. I can go to any place in the world and play Charles Ives, and they can respond to it. They don't need a translator. Music is a communicative means by which I can express something to someone, no matter what keeps us apart, language or any other way, because of the way that we're wired as human beings. This is the great, great communication vehicle. If the whole world sang, we would have a terrific world. because we would get to know each other, to know that we share things. You can do it best in music. And when people can't express things in words, they use music. It is the great art. It is the great way to communicate, to share, to find unity. And does the world need it?
Those are some great points, and especially about bringing unity into the world, especially with a lot of stuff that we see now on the news, and it's important role for everybody, and I definitely agree. So with that said then, with this podcast focusing on a lot of the administrative leadership tactics or duties that are involved in being a musical director too, that deals with a lot of people who've influenced us in our life. So could you talk about some people who have been important leaders in your life and have made an impact on you, and some lessons you've taken away from your time with them?
Warren Benson has been probably the most important influence in my life musically. And it came about because I was in Ithaca. I taught at Ithaca High School. Warren was there teaching at Ithaca College. Corral Husa, Walter Beeler, those people all came to my concerts. And after my second year and my spring concert, which I thought was fantastic, and everybody else did too, Warren stood around until everybody had left, and then he came up and he says, Frank, you've done a wonderful job. He says, but why do you play that funny music? I was crushed. And so a couple of weeks goes by, I'm thinking about what Warren says. I know that, at that time in the 1950s, we didn't have much good music, and it was funny music. So I finally got up the courage to call Warren and say, Warren, look you can't criticize me unless you do something about it. And that's when I commissioned him to write the first piece for me. But Warren constantly challenged me, constantly made me aware of what I had to grow, how I had to grow, how I had to get better in the musical things, how I had to learn more music, how I had to grow. He was constantly, he was a great friend, and we were great friends, but he was constantly motivating me, stimulating me. And the other person who was important was Fred Fennell, because Fred was he was the image of the band director being a real professional conductor. And so we had a wonderful relationship. Fred guest conducted my band every single year, came down to the high school, spent time with the band. I took the band to every single Eastman Wind Ensemble concert in Rochester, a 100-mile trip one way. I took them to every single concert that they played from 1955 to 1967. He was a great influence, just as I said, as a model of a professional conductor conducting a wind group. Those are probably the two most important influences in my musical development.
Yeah, and they're certainly great names in our profession as well, and it's great to hear that they've had a significant impact on your career as well. So with that said, aside from people that have made an impact, there's also a lot of people that have been impacted by you, including a previous guest, Scott Rush, who I did promise, to ask. So out of all the students that you've ever had, would you say that Scott Rush is your favorite student of all time?
Scott is a wonderful, wonderful musician. He's a wonderful person. He's one of my favorite people. Doug, I'd like to just say one other thing, if I may. How does a band director know whether they're influencing their students in the ways that they want? How do we do that? Have you heard from anyone else on how they did it?
As far as that component, I have not heard much.
Okay, well, here's something that you might find interesting. I would put I would get a manila folder, put blank sheets in it, put the student's name on it, and give one to every single student in my band. I told them that I wanted them to write in there all the things they read, all the movies they went to, all the concerts they went to, because I wanted to know what they were doing when they weren't with me, when they had free time and free money. How were they choosing to use it? Because you and I, when we have free time and free money, we tend to do the things that we like, that we value. So by doing that, they would turn them in every single week. I would read through them, and probably in most cases write a little note to them, a response to them, because it isn't what they do for us in rehearsal. It's what they do outside when they have free time and they have free money. Are they doing things that we think we want them to do, or we think would be good for them to do? That's always the case. What they do out of school will determine whether we have had any influence in school.
Those are certainly some great points, and even to tie Scott Rush back into that, I know on his episode a few weeks ago in the podcast, he did talk about one of his latest books where you talk about the significance of an educator and what we can do to create that impact of significance into the lives outside of the classroom for our students. So really great points. So now to wrap some things up with this last question, what advice would you give to music educators to help their students thrive?
Well, I would say be strong, be considerate, be determined, be joyous, and be humble in your service to students and the great art of music. Be a model of how a person who is a music lover behaves. In other words, in your behavior, show the students why music makes a difference.
And that's a great endpoint, Mr. Battisti. I really appreciate that. So, with all that said, I would like to thank you again for all of your time and wisdom. I really appreciated the chance and opportunity and pleasure to speak with you on the podcast, and I know our listeners are going to love listening to this for their own professional development as well. And again, I'd like to thank you for all of your time and nothing but the best.
Thank you. I enjoyed it, Doug.
This concludes our episode. Many thanks to Mr. Frank Battisti for his time, wisdom, and insight on sharing his views and philosophies on music education, as well as the important role music plays into the human experience. If you enjoyed today's episode, please make sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play Music, and iHeartRadio, as well as liking and following the show page on Facebook under Director Circle to stay updated on all news and future episodes. This is Doug Conrad saying thank you for listening, and be sure to tune in to the next edition of Director's Circle.